On a winter evening in Cedar Rapids, store cameras recorded 3 young men walking into a local Walmart and purchasing 2 machetes, exactly like the one seen here, along with a pair of gloves. Over the next 29 hours, one of those men put on these exact clear-framed glasses. He held up his phone and took more than 200 selfies wearing them. By the time he took the first photo, the original owner of those glasses was already dead. Her name was Melody Hoffman. She was 20 years old. During the trials that followed, her mother, Megan, placed a photograph of her on the witness stand and described a daughter who was deeply kind and caring. Melody had an intellectual disability, and her family noted that she trusted the people in her life easily, even her ex-boyfriend, who she still considered a close friend. Following her murder, 2 of the men who went to that Walmart were convicted and sentenced to serve the rest of their lives in prison. The 3rd man took a different route. He told investigators he had lost his nerve before the actual killing, and he walked out of court with a suspended sentence and probation. The legal system appeared to have settled the case. But yesterday, the terms of that 3rd man's freedom collapsed, bringing the final unresolved piece of this crime back before a judge. To understand how the crime unfolded on February 18, 2024, investigators looked to this digital map. By pulling data from Melody's own Apple Watch and iPhone, police reconstructed the route of her kidnapping. The timeline tracked McKinley Louisma, her ex-boyfriend, alongside Dakota Van Patten, as they forced her out of Cedar Rapids. The data trail ended roughly 20 miles away at Lily Lake in Amana. That is where searchers found Melody's body. She had been strangled and beaten, and she had suffered numerous severe stab and slash wounds. While the physical evidence tracked their movements, it was the record of the defendant's behavior immediately following the crime that investigators would soon present in court. Surveillance footage from a local convenience store captured Louisma and Van Patten casually walking the aisles and purchasing cigars shortly after the murder. Prosecutors later used this footage to contrast their calm demeanor with the violence that had just occurred. Investigators then searched Louisma's phone. At 4:05 a.m. that same night, he accessed a photograph showing Melody bound with duct tape, bleeding from her nose, and crying. Then came the evidence found on Dakota Van Patten's device. Over a 29-hour span beginning the afternoon of the murder, Van Patten systematically photographed himself wearing Melody's clear-framed glasses, saving over 200 individual selfies. These digital artifacts established a minute-by-minute timeline of the events, arming prosecutors with the evidence they needed to pursue mandatory life sentences. McKinley Louisma faced a jury first in late 2024. The trial was brief, ending with convictions for first-degree murder and kidnapping, which triggered a mandatory life term in an Iowa prison. Dakota Van Patten went to trial in September 2025. His defense team attempted to separate him from the violence. At sentencing, Judge Chad Kepros imposed the mandatory life sentence for the murder and then explicitly ran the kidnapping sentence consecutively. The judge stated the kidnapping represented an entirely separate act of torture that required its own distinct punishment. Melody's father, TJ Hoffman, delivered his victim impact statement directly to Van Patten. He told the defendant he was no longer human, that he was a monster who the world would soon forget. For the 2 men who carried out the killing, the trials concluded with finality. That left one remaining defendant from the Walmart footage whose legal status remained an open question. Logan Kimpton bypassed a trial entirely by entering an Alford plea. As you can see in this breakdown, it allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while legally acknowledging prosecutors hold enough evidence to convince a jury of their guilt. Kimpton pleaded guilty to a single count of conspiracy to commit a forcible felony. Kimpton told investigators he had been involved in the planning, but left before Melody was killed. Based on his plea, a judge gave him a suspended 10-year prison sentence, allowing him to walk out of court on 3 years of probation. Even then, TJ Hoffman offered Kimpton a remarkable degree of grace. In court, he looked at the young man and told him that despite the horror of the case, he intended to lead with hope rather than hatred, and he urged Kimpton to find the strength to do the same. But Kimpton struggled to maintain his side of the agreement. By April 2026, a probation violation report surfaced, citing missed check-ins and positive drug tests for both methamphetamine and THC.
2 months later, he walked away from a work release facility and was charged as an escapee. Which brings the timeline to yesterday, August 10, 2026. Because of those violations, a judge formally revoked Logan Kimpton's probation. The Hoffman family's journey towards justice has been a grueling, multi-year marathon, and this final hearing marks the point where the man who claimed he chickened out may finally face the full prison sentence he was originally spared.
Welcome to This Explainer. Look, today we're unpacking a case that is honestly as complex as it is chilling. We're tracking the incredibly dark, escalating criminal path of a man named Dakota Van Patten. And the reason we're diving into this specific case today is because there has just been a major real-time update in the justice system regarding this exact story. Let's get right into it. 200. Just take a second to think about that number. You really have to ask yourself, what kind of person does something so entirely unsettling? What could this number actually mean in the aftermath of a horrific crime? Well, it represents selfies, specifically the number of selfies Dakota Van Patten took of himself over a tight 29-hour period. But here is the truly disturbing part. He was taking these pictures wearing his victim's glasses, literally right after committing a brutal, premeditated murder. It's a detail that really sets the stage for understanding his absolute psychological descent. Section 1. The victim, Melody Hoffman. Before we get into the perpetrators, we absolutely have to ground this story in reality. We need to remember who the victim was, straight from the people who loved her most. At the sentencing, her mom, Megan Hoffman, set a senior portrait of her daughter right there on the witness stand and described her 20-year-old girl simply as kind and caring. It is absolutely crucial that we focus on Melody's gentle, trusting nature, rather than defining her simply by the vulnerabilities that these men tragically exploited. Melody, who had an intellectual disability, was a young woman who was just incredibly trusting of everyone in her life. And, that extended to her ex-boyfriend, McKinley Louisma. She actually still considered him a friend, even after they split up. Tragically, it was exactly that trusting nature that put her directly into the path of Dakota Van Patten.
Section 2. A path of escalation.
Okay, let's dive into this. How do we even arrive at such a horrific outcome? We have to look at how Van Patten's violent behavior escalated so rapidly, literally in a matter of weeks. The sheer brazenness is wild. In January 2024, Van Patten and Luigi Mema get arrested together for assaulting a guy at an apartment, and they're released on bond. So they're already out on bond for a violent crime, right? Then, just weeks later in early February, cameras catch Van Patten at a Walmart buying machetes and gloves. That chilling premeditation leads straight to February 18th, the brutal kidnapping and murder of Melody Hoffman.
This contrast here brilliantly illustrates the cold, disturbing apathy of these guys. Look at this. On one hand, you have the premeditation, buying 2 machetes and gloves. On the other hand, the immediate aftermath, surveillance footage showing them at a convenience store just casually buying cigars. Prosecutors would later use this exact timeline to show a jury just how completely unaffected these men seemed by the gruesome acts they had literally just committed.
Section 3. Gathering the evidence. So investigators had to piece together what on earth happened in the dark hours between those two purchases, and it led them across a sprawling 20-mile crime scene. The key takeaway here is the massive digital footprint that completely unraveled the crime. The police didn't have to guess. They followed the data. They used Melody's own iPhone and Apple Watch to track her movement from Morgan Creek Park, where she was taken, all the way to Lily Lake, where she was found. They pulled all the surveillance footage. But maybe the most damning piece of digital evidence? A photo recovered from Louisma's phone, time-stamped at 4:05 a.m. that night, showing Melody bound with duct tape, crying and bleeding.
While the digital footprint was huge, the physical evidence was just undeniable. When investigators searched Dakota Van Patten's own home, they recovered a towing rope, which they believed was used in her death. And sitting right next to it, Melody's clear-framed glasses. This physical evidence definitively connected his home to the brutal strangulation and to those chilling selfies we talked about earlier. Section 4. The courtroom reckoning. Now let's transition to the legal aftermath. Because there were 3 different defendants in this conspiracy, the justice system handed down 3 wildly different fates. McKinley Louisma and Dakota Van Patten both faced the ultimate consequences: mandatory life sentences for first-degree murder and kidnapping. But take a look at that third row. A third man, Logan Kimpton, pleaded to conspiracy and somehow walked away with a suspended 10-year sentence. He literally walked out of court on probation.
During Dakota Van Patten's trial in September 2025, his defense team tried to spin it that he was merely present, not an active participant. Well, prosecuting attorney Nick Maybanks pushed back hard on that in his closing arguments. He brought up that jarring detail of the 200 selfies. He pointed right at the photograph of Van Patten wearing Melody's glasses and told the jury that while he might wear them, quote, he would never see the world the way she had. It was a devastatingly powerful argument that really nailed down the guilty verdict. And the judge absolutely recognized the sheer brutality of Van Patten's path, too. Judge Chad Kepros handed down the mandatory life sentence for the murder, but then he took it a step further. He imposed a consecutive sentence for the kidnapping charge. By stacking it onto the life sentence, the judge was making a very clear statement, citing the kidnapping as an entirely separate act of extreme cruelty and torture that went way beyond the murder itself.
At this sentencing, Melody's father, TJ Hoffman, delivered just an incredibly powerful victim impact statement. He stood up, looked directly at Dakota Van Patten in that courtroom, and told him he wasn't even human. He called him, quote, a monster who would be forgotten.
Now, you're probably wondering about that third man, Logan Kimpton, the guy caught on camera at Walmart buying the machetes. How in the world does he get probation? Well, he used something called an Alford plea. As defined here, this is a legal maneuver where a defendant officially maintains their innocence, but admits on the record that prosecutors have enough evidence to convict them anyway. Kimpton claimed he chickened out before the actual killing, and this specific plea deal is what allowed him to dodge prison completely.
Section 5. An unresolved ending.
So this brings us right to the present day, and honestly, it's exactly why we're doing this explainer right now. We are currently watching a breaking failure in the justice system unfold regarding that exact plea deal. In January 2026, Logan Kimpton walks free on probation. Fast forward to June 2026, he walks away from a work release facility. His violation reports are citing missed check-ins and testing positive for meth. And then, just yesterday, August 10th, 2026, his probation was formally revoked. The guy who claimed he chickened out couldn't even follow the basic rules of his own freedom for a few months.
And so that leaves us with this massive unresolved question to end the explainer on. Will this third man finally face his original 10-year prison sentence? Look, Dakota Van Patten and McKinley Louisma are going to die in prison for what they did. But for Melody Hoffman's family, the final pursuit of justice isn't just history. It's playing out right now, waiting on a judge's decision. What do you think true justice actually looks like at the very end of this dark path?